From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. One of the many pleasures of hosting this podcast is having the good fortune to speak with people who are a whole lot smarter than I am, but who also patiently explain their ideas in straightforward ways that even I can understand. And still better is when they do so with a light touch and good humor. As you're about to hear, today's Blue Sky guest is one of these people. On this episode, Dr. Adam Mastroianni will graciously explain to me the research and writing he's done on a curious psychological phenomenon, which he describes as a bug in our mental system. Today, and throughout history it seems, our brains trick us into thinking the world is getting worse, when in fact, it's actually improving. Dr. Adam Mastroianni is an experimental psychologist and author of the science blog Experimental History. He earned his PhD in psychology from Harvard in 2021, and his work has been featured everywhere from the New York Times to Jimmy Kimmel Live. When he isn't doing science or writing about it, Adam teaches and performs improv comedy. He also once came in second on a British reality show about hosting dinner parties, and he played a supporting character in the 2020 feature film Love, Weddings, and Other Disasters, which, as he points out in his bio, currently has a 3% score on Rotten Tomatoes. By the way, I looked up the movie. It stars Diane Keaton and Jeremy Irons. Not too shabby, but I'm afraid that 3% number hasn't budged since Adam wrote about it in his bio. Adam's originally from Monroeville, Ohio, population 1,400, and now splits his time between Chicago and Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Adam Mastroianni as much as I did. Adam Mastroianni, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure for me to have you on. And I wanted to start with how you describe yourself on your own website and the work you do. You say, I study how people perceive and misperceive their social worlds, from the person sitting across the table to the whole country buzzing around them. And you write about these on your Substack blog, Experimental History. You're a smart guy with a wide range of interests. How did you home in on this as your major field of study?
I went through everything else that I didn't stick is the short version. So when I began my PhD, I sat down with my advisor and he told me, someone asked me recently, what percent of my life goals have I achieved? And I told him 140%. I've done more than I ever thought I would. And now I just want to do cool stuff. So why don't you bring me some interesting ideas to talk about? And that's what I did for the next 6 months. I would come in with 3 to 10 ideas every week. We'd talk through each one of them, pull it open, dissect it, see if there's anything interesting in it. And most of them died on the operating table, but a few survived to the next conversation and a few survived to the conversation after that. And the ones that did were about the errors and biases that arise in conversation that turned into do conversations end when people want them to. Yeah. And the other was this idea that people think that people have gotten worse, which had been percolating in my mind for a long time because I had heard so many people complain about it, but took a while to turn into like the psychological version of that idea.
It's fascinating. And that's where I'd like to go. Your New York Times piece, I believe came out in June, got a lot of attention, certainly got mine. And the headline was great. It was, your brain has tricked you into thinking everything is worse. And in there you say, I believe there's a bug, a set of cognitive biases in people's brains that cause them to perceive a fall from grace even when it hasn't happened. Why is that?
So I think there are two psychological phenomena that can combine to produce an illusion of decline even where one hasn't happened. And these individual phenomena, we can go into this more, but I don't think these themselves are actually bugs. I think there's a good reason why they exist, but they have this downside of producing this illusion. So the first one is what we think of as a negativity bias. Yes. So this has been documented in other research that people are more likely to pay attention to negative information, and in return, that is what gets served to them, right? In the media, they call this "if it bleeds, it leads."
Yep.
If you've ever received a piece of homework back, like an essay with comments on it, you probably immediately forget the nice ones, and you just remember the thing that said, like,
Yep.
"I don't think this is right," right?
Yep.
So it's pretty clear that we have this bias, but that alone isn't enough to produce an illusion of change over time. That's enough to make it seem like you look around at the world and the world doesn't seem very good. To make it seem like it's gotten worse over time, you need a second phenomenon, which memory researchers call the fading affect bias. And this is just a phenomenon where the badness of bad memories fades faster than the goodness of good memories. So, for instance, if you got turned down for your high school prom,
Yep.
probably feels pretty bad in the moment. But 20 years later, when you think back on it, it probably doesn't feel so bad, or maybe even feels like a funny story because you went on to meet your soulmate and how lucky you were that you didn't end up with that person.
Right.
If instead you had a great high school prom, when you look back at it 20 years later, it doesn't feel as good as it did in the moment, but it still feels pretty good to think about it. And this turns out to be what happens on average to memories. Not to every single one, but on average, that the bad ones tend to fade faster, lose more of their badness, more than the good ones lose their goodness. And if you put that together with the negativity bias, you can create this illusion where every day the world looks bad, but every day it seems like it wasn't so bad the day before. But if we had asked you the day before, you would have told us the same thing.
Fascinating. And it also applies, as I understand your work, it's, we think that things were better during our lifetime, earlier in our lifetime, but it also goes back to before we were born, the good old days, the bygone days. Is that the negativity bias? What's happening there?
Yeah. So this is actually a really interesting finding so we asked people, okay, rate how kind, honest, nice, and good people are today. Then what about the year in which you were 20? Then what about the year in which you were born, which are obviously different years for different participants. And then we asked, okay, what about 20 years before you were born and 40 years before you were born? And what they tell us is that it's stable. Then I get born, and then things get worse. So there's no difference between 40 years before I was born, 20 years before I was born, the year of my birth. People were all pretty good then. And then it's only between the year I was born and the year I turned 20 that people start to get worse. And then they keep getting worse my whole life. So even though it is true that if you compared today to, say, 40 years before people were born, they would say things got worse since then. But they don't mean that things got worse steadily every year since then. They mean things really started getting worse around the time that I arrived on Earth, which I think suggests that this is a memory bias rather than like, oh, we've all heard that the 1950s were a great time and we think things have gotten worse from them, because the year of people's birth is obviously different for each person. But
Right.
It didn't matter. It wasn't like everyone said, oh, things got worse in the same year. They said things started getting worse when I started being alive.
So you may have just answered my question, and it's an unfair one, but it's sort of a thought experiment. If you were able to go back in time and do this same study in 1910, you expect the same results? Because that would take away this, we blame a lot today on the current deluge of negative media.
Yeah.
And there was less of it then. You think you'd have the same results?
That's my bet. I mean, for a few reasons. One is, although we can't run that particular study in the past, there's plenty of archival data from the past, going back to 1949, where people are asked questions like, do you think people used to be nicer to one another? And in every time this question is asked in all different kinds of ways, it's since that first data collection, people have said yes. A majority of Americans go, yes, people used to be nicer. And they say the further back in time you go, the more they say that things have gotten worse since then. We also find that although people say that, yes, things have gotten worse just in the past few years, when everyone can think of like, oh, the political events that signal our decline, they also say that things got worse between the year they were born and the year they turned 20, even if that was a very long time ago. And they think that things keep getting worse between the year they turn 20 and today. So it doesn't seem to be that like there's just some particular period in time where everybody looks out on the world and goes, that is when things got worse. Another piece of evidence is we don't have as much data from outside the US, but there were some good studies done by Pew in 2002 and 2006, where they asked people in 60 different countries, is moral decline a problem in your country? And obviously, each country is facing a very different set of circumstances in those years, right? Like the situation in Chile is not the same as the situation in China, is not the same as the situation in Rwanda. And yet in every single country that was surveyed, a majority of people said, yes, people are worse today than they were in the past, which also suggests that like it's not really about current events because you can change the current events and you get the same answer.
Now that you have a sense for Adam's intellect and personality, imagine his response to the PhD advisor who asked him to bring him interesting ideas. Talk about a kid in a candy store. And I find the idea of this bug, as he describes it, to be particularly interesting. The concept of our brains tricking us into believing things are getting worse certainly rings true to me. I'd heard of the negativity bias, but the fading affect bias was a new one to me, and it explains a lot. And this idea that we tend to believe that the world was a better place until the year we were born is pretty wild. And this isn't just a US or even a Western phenomenon, but a tendency shown in research from 60 different countries around the world. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Adam to share his thoughts about whether a general ignorance of history contributes to the phenomenon of the inaccurate belief in the world's deterioration. One of the things I've wondered is how much of this might be an ignorance of history. And I say that as someone, I love history, and I remember, and I've talked about this before on the show, when President Trump was elected in 2016, a lot of people were very upset about it. And it happens in November, and there were year-end editorials that year that said 2016 is the worst year in American history. And I thought to myself, have you read history? and Kevin Kelly I had on the show, and he has a great line where he said, if you only read the news, you'll think that things have never been worse. But if you read history, you'll realize things have never been better. And that's stuck with me. And I just wonder, do you think that's part of it? It's just a ignorance or lack of interest in history?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. I think coupled with the fact that history just doesn't feel, it doesn't have the same potency as current events do. That even when you learn about terrible things that happened in history, you can understand in an abstract sense that they were bad, but it kind of seems like they all worked out at least well enough for us to be here today, right? So like, right. I understand, I was born in 1991. So I understand that like shortly before that, people were really worried about, a nuclear bomb landing on the United States, but one didn't, right? So I kind of go, well, but were people really all that worried about it? It seems like they were worried about nothing. Could it really have been that bad? And I'm sure today there are things that we are worried about that in the future people will go, I can't believe that they thought they had real problems. Today we have the real problems. Like the real problems only began when I gained political consciousness. And the fact is like every era has its own political problems, political and otherwise, obviously, that like they hurt and they're scary. And what makes them the scariest is not knowing how they're going to turn out. But that is unfortunately what it feels like to be alive. You don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah. So I graduated from high school 7 years before you were born. How about that? And this summer I had the privilege of giving a high school graduation speech. And I actually had to remind myself, because I was trying to make this point and say, okay, when I was in your seat, graduating from high school, here's what the world was like. And some of these things I had to go back and check. But for example, apartheid was in place. The Berlin Wall was up. My generation gets blamed for whiffing on climate change. Fair enough. But when I was graduating from high school, it was acid rain and the ozone layer, right? And AIDS was stampeding and we didn't even know what it was, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, if I'm one of those students, it's like, well, those things didn't happen. So what's the big deal? But when I got to college the next year, all people were talking about was divesting from companies doing business in South Africa. So I think your point's a good one. And I'm not sure how we make people, or if it's even worth our while to make people think more about how anxiety riddled we were years ago. But I worry that this becomes self-perpetuating too, that we say things are worse, they're worse, they're worse, they're worse. And then there's political ramifications, which we should talk about. But do you think it is helpful to try to drive home history more with people and put things? When people say we've never been more divided politically, the Civil War comes to mind, at least to me. Right? Yeah. When I was in graduate school, there was a statue of Charles Sumner right off campus, who was a guy. That was caned nearly to death by another senator. Bludgeoned. For a dispute over slavery, right? And I got to walk by that statue all the time and think like, man, like that is a different world, and I really hope we don't get back to the world in which senators are bludgeoning one another.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that like everything's fine now. But it does mean that like even the things that feel unprecedented often have a precedent. Like things being unprecedented is in fact precedented.
Right.
And I think that is actually the lesson that's difficult to draw from history, that it kind of feels like, well, each thing is a thing unto itself. And so, yes, we had a civil war, but that was its own thing. And then something else happened, and that was its own thing. And then our time is happening, and that's its own thing. And in each era, everything is unknown and new. And like, yes, that is actually what it's like to live in history. Each next thing is unknown and new. And it doesn't mean that there's something different about ours, even though, yes, like there is obviously something different. But the fact is, there's always been something different. So this feeling of living in unique times, I think has always been true.
Right.
We live in unique times, and so has everybody else.
So as we dive so deeply into this, there may be people listening saying, well, just why does this matter? And in addition to, I think, contributing to just a general sense of pessimism and doom and anxiety, there's also, and you point this out in your piece, and I think it's very important, that this idea of things used to be so much better is fodder for potential autocrats, for people who say we got to go back to the good old days. And to me, that's where it can get dangerous. Is that something that you're concerned about?
Yeah. So if you think that things have gotten worse, then you think that some switch has been flipped that made the worst times come.
Right.
Whether that's like, oh, we had some shift in our culture. We let swear words on TV. We published the wrong books. We invented the wrong technology. And if you think that switch has been flipped, then you want to unflip that switch and get back to the times that were better. The problem is, in this case, like there is no trend to explain. And so flipping any switches is not going to make us go back to that time, because that time never existed. And so in one of the archival studies we collected for this paper, in 2014, like 76% of Americans said the government should do something about the moral breakdown of the country, which the government should do many things about many things, right? Like there's climate change, there's inequality, there's a lot of real problems to solve. What they should not do is waste their time on this fake problem that exists only in our biased memories, and instead focus on the other ones that exist in reality. So yeah, that I think is the danger. And obviously, there are people who aspire to positions of power based on the promise of restoring those times. But if they didn't exist in the first place, you shouldn't trust someone who's promising to bring them back.
And Steven Pinker, who I believe you studied under, who's a huge fan of yours, by the way, he said, you ought to talk to one of my favorite students. And I said, I've already got him lined up, so thank you. But when he spoke with me, he made an interesting point about democratic politics that almost invite this sort of thing, because as he describes it, if I'm running, especially against an incumbent, for me to say that the incumbent's doing a lousy job, I have to be saying it was better before they got the job, right? So it almost forces this discussion of a belief that things used to be better, and I'm going to restore that because this bum in office has gotten us here. Is that something that's fair to say?
Yeah. It's a tricky situation. Also, because if you claim that things used to be better, it is a claim that it's possible for things to be better, right? Which is less certain than saying, hey guys, things are okay now, but I believe by doing things we've never done before, we can create an era that we've never experienced before, but it will be better. Trust me. Like it's just it's less of a good sales pitch. And saying that things used to be better also evokes this sense of loss that
Yes.
that I used to have this good thing and now I can get it back, which I think is more motivating than I can get you a new good thing that you've never seen before. So yeah, it's tricky.
So to play a little devil's advocate, and I'm wondering, and I'd like to talk to you about how you did this research, because it's not a simple thing to figure out. But when we talk about moral decay, I'll play devil's advocate, and I would assume that there's some people in your surveys who truly see what some of us might see as increased tolerance as negative permissiveness. And there are people banning books today that discuss transgender issues, or they see same-sex marriage announcements in the newspaper, and that upsets. Is there a meaningful percentage of people that you speak to who have, I don't want to use the word legitimate, but genuinely look at specific issues and say that's moral decline?
Yep.
Does that show up in your research?
Yes. So this is obviously a big obstacle we have to overcome to write a paper like The Illusion of Moral Decline.
Yes.
If we could have called it something like The Illusion of Decline in Kindness, Honesty, Friendliness, Ethicality, Civility, stuff like that, you know what we mean, but we ran out of characters in the title. But that is what we mean. And that
Okay.
actually turns out to be mostly what people mean, even when they say that morality has declined. So I can come at this question a few different ways. One is when you ask people, has morality declined? And they say yes. And you ask them, well, what did you mean by that? You can look at the answers that people give, and their top answers are things that people generally agree on, that at least are bad.
Right.
So they say things like, our government and business leaders lie to us. Parents don't instill values in their children. People don't treat one another with respect. And so I think any reasonable person looking at those things would go, yes, if those things are indeed happening, that is bad. So that's one way of answering the question. Another is to ask many different questions and see if it changes people's answers. So sometimes some of these questions use the word morality, but some don't. Some use more specific things where there's less debate on what it means. So for instance, do you think people are as honest as they used to be? It's a little clearer what it means to be honest. And even there, people will say, no, people are less honest today. We find this as well, even when we make the question really specific. So there was a meta-analysis, just like a study of studies that came out a couple of years ago, where they looked at cooperation rates in economic games in the laboratory over the course of a few decades. So these are studies where you come in and the researchers are like, hey, we're going to give you some money and you can make some choices about how that money gets dispersed. You can either basically choose to keep more of it for yourself, or you can choose to give some of it to this other person who's here in the lab. These games have different rules. They're not even really games. They're pretty bad games as far as it goes. But basically, we're giving people the option of being greedy or being generous. And what the researchers expected to find over time is that from 1956 to 2017, the years they were looking at, they expected to find that people were less likely to be generous over time. In fact, they found the opposite. People were more likely to pick the generous option in between those 2 years. So all we did was take their data and describe the study to a new set of participants. Like, okay, here are some studies that have been run. People come into the lab, they have this game, they can be greedy, they can be generous. Here are some of the payouts they could have gotten. We want you to estimate over time how people's answers or how people's responses may have changed or not changed. Do you think people were more likely to pick this option or that option between these 2 years? And by the way, we will pay you extra money if you get this right. And even there, people told us, oh, I think people were more likely to be greedy today than they were in 1956 by about 10 percentage points, when in fact it goes about 10 percentage points in the opposite direction. So even when you make the question really specific, even when you can compare it to a pretty good guess at reality, and even when you pay people to get the answer right, they still say this thing got worse when in this case it actually got better.
I was glad that Adam mentioned the incident that history has come to know as the caning of Sumner. Some more historical background here, because I like history, and this particular story helps put our current political discourse in greater perspective. In 1856, as the U.S. approached what would turn out to be a full-scale civil war, a scathing anti-slavery speech by Senator Charles Sumner so enraged a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks that Brooks entered the Senate chambers after that body had adjourned and bludgeoned Sumner with his metal-topped cane. He didn't just strike him once, but repeatedly for about a full minute. Brooks nearly killed Sumner, but quickly became a hero in the South. Not only did he survive a censure resolution, but he was soon to be re-elected to his seat. All this to say, let's fight our fading affect bias, a phrase I was determined to use in a sentence today, by the way, and realize that American politics has long been combative and divisive. And back to this psychological bug we seem to have, the data on people actually getting more generous, not less, in the last several decades is pretty striking, and we'd be wise to let these facts sink in. I also like the way Adam describes his research and the creative techniques that he and his colleagues use. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Adam to reflect on a favorite blue sky topic, the role of media in shaping our attitudes and outlook. To the extent that media has always preyed, I think, upon, salaciousness and those kind of stories, it bleeds, it leads. That's one thing, but now we consume so much more of it, right? And so when it comes to things like we've declined on civil discourse or politeness or whatever, well, when I turn on the TV and I watch news shows where people are screaming at each other, or frankly, even, a sports network or sports talk where it's the hot take and they're screaming about this or that or the other thing, that would cloud my judgment, I would think, and I'm consuming more of it than I used to. Is that fair?
Yeah, although in our model, we actually think it's the ratio that matters the most rather than the overall amount.
Hmm.
So the way that we think this matters is basically like how much bad per unit good do you encounter,
Right.
and that's what really drives the difference. We have one study that I think gets at this because those two explanations that I gave you, that primarily we encounter negative information and it fades faster than positive information. If you can actually flip those switches, you might be able to get the opposite illusion, which is that
Right.
things are better now than they used to be. So if you start with, I mainly encounter good things about the world, but over time, all of my memories fade. So I'm losing some of that goodness. I'm losing badness too, but I don't have that much badness to begin with. So on average, in memory, I'm going back towards zero, which makes me think, okay, today is a higher number than yesterday. So we've actually had improvement. And we think a domain in which this is true, in which you primarily encounter positive information, is in your personal world. Mainly, the interactions you have with people that you know and love are good.
Right.
And so we ran a study where we asked people, okay, how kind, honest, nice, and good are people that you know today and that you've known for the past 15 years? What are they like today? And what were they like 15 years ago? And people told us on average, like, oh, they're better now.
Huh.
People in general, they said they're worse, but people I know are better. And so like everybody's on their own little island saying, my island is good. It's getting better. But it's all the other islands that are getting worse. But if you visit people on those islands, they'll say, no, my island's getting better. It's your island that's getting worse.
Interesting.
So I think you can flip this depending on the ratio of good to bad.
And is the my island, your island, is that also applied to, a small friend group versus the world? Like when you ask people, what's your favorability rating of Congress? It's very low. How do you like your congressperson? It's quite high. Is that part of this phenomenon? Is that an example?
Yeah, it could be that basically the more specific you get, the more constrained you get about the kinds of answers that people could give. We never ran this study, but we did think about asking people like, okay, imagine that everybody either has brown eyes or blue eyes. Think about brown-eyed people today. Like how kind, nice, honest, nice, and good were they 20 years ago compared to today? What about blue-eyed people? We've now asked you about everybody. Do you say the same thing about the subgroups that you say about the overall group? We never ran it because we thought people maybe wouldn't get it or think we were just asking them weird questions. But one guess is that actually as you make this more specific, you make it more and more difficult for people to just rely on their intuitions and give this idea that things are getting worse. And the more you make them think and realize like, well, I don't have any reason why I would think that people with brown eyes have gotten less nice. So maybe it hasn't happened. So basically, like using some kind of cognitive explanation to override this general feeling that you have. We think it's a possibility, but we don't know. We haven't run the study.
So it could have contributed to some of this. Also, be what I recall from my high school science. I think a phrase that I'll probably misuse: a confirmation bias, where if I walk around thinking things are getting worse, I'm going to look for things. And one of the examples I get concerned about is with climate change, which is absolutely a very serious problem and the impacts are happening. But every hot day or every wildfire or every hurricane, people latch on to, well, that's climate change, when in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. And then also the deluge from media. So I used to work at the Weather Channel, and we used to, in an odd way, sort of lament the fact that we never got footage of tornadoes. They happen really quickly, right? Well, now you get footage of tornadoes all the time because everyone's walking around with a video camera in their pocket. And guess what? People, if you ask the average person, wouldn't be worth your time to do this research, but I guarantee you 9 out of 10 people think there are more tornadoes today than there used to be. And there aren't. There's just more footage of tornadoes.
Yeah.
But it also gets conflated with climate change. And so is that, I'm rambling a bit, but is that fair that this confirmation bias would contribute to this problem?
Yeah. That if you have an underlying theory of the world and you go out to find evidence for it, you're going to be able to do it. So in our studies, when we ask people, okay, why do you think people are less kind than they used to be? And for the minority of people who say that people are more kind than they used to be, we also ask them why. And what's interesting is one of the most common answers for both groups is social media. Right. So the people who say people have gotten worse, they go like, well, now you can yell at people anonymously online. Look at Twitter. Right. People have gotten worse. But the people who say people have gotten better go, now you can see people that you never would have been able to interact with before, and you see that they're not so bad. That like this is why people have gotten better.
Right.
And like I think obviously both of those things can be true, right? And it's unclear which of those things is true on average. And like answering that question would be really difficult. But both of these people just had an underlying theory about how the world has changed, and then they saw something in the world that has changed at around the same time, and they go, oh, well, both of these things are changing. It must be because of the effect of this new thing that we have that causes the change. Even though 50 years ago, it probably would have been something else. It would have been,
right.
Well, now we've got televisions in every home, and that's what's causing it.
Right, and Elvis Presley is corrupting our
Yes.
youth. And yes. Okay, so one of my questions is going to be, so where do you go from here with your research and what's next? And I believe this was a subsequent article that I read. I think that the headline was "Things Could Be Better," and you talk about, and I'm trying to understand if this confirms this other work, or is it a slight difference on it. Could you talk about this, where you ask people, could such and such a thing be different? They often describe how it could be better. And what does that teach us, and how should we think about that?
Yeah. So these are studies where we got a long list of items, and so like cars, the vacations you take, the music you listen to, your toothbrush, your desk, the education system, and just ask, how could this be different? And people type out some ways it could be different. And then we show what they typed back to them and go, okay, if it were different in this way, would it be worse, or would it be neutrally different, or would it be better? And overwhelmingly, they tell us it'd be better for every single item we've ever asked them. Even things they think are really good. So like the best item in the data set, that when we ask people how good is this thing right now, was pets. People love pets more than they love itself.
Yes,
at least in that study. But when we ask people, well, how could pets be different? They go, oh, they could not poop on the carpet, like they could not shed, like they could not bark.
They wouldn't die too young.
Yes, and the reason we ran this, we were trying to get at, how do people judge how things are good or bad? And we thought that it might be the ease with which you can imagine ways that things are better or worse. Don't think we actually got the answer to that question, because it turns out it's very easy to imagine how everything could be better. But I think this does possibly explain why people don't generally feel satisfied with the way that things are, because even as things get better, we keep imagining how they could be even better than that.
Right.
So if you move from a cramped apartment to your first house, you go, oh, yes, like finally I got my first, but it'd be nice if I had a bigger house. And you move to a bigger house and you're like, yeah, but actually what I need is a second house. You get a second house. You're like, it'd be so much better if there weren't so many taxes on my houses.
Yes, yes.
And like, there is no point at which you stop thinking about the ways that things could be better. And maybe that makes you less satisfied with the way that things are right now.
And I guess it happens in our capitalist consumer economy too. I walked by an Apple store, whatever day it was last week, when the new iPhones were coming out, and the lines around the corner at this Apple store. And I'd read up on these phones. They're better, I guess. But, right? Somehow it's just, oh yeah, but the camera's better. Or yeah, but it's an eighth of an ounce lighter, or whatever. Is that part of it too? The sort of consumer culture that's just feeding us, you could be thinner, you could have a lighter weight jacket, you could have a better phone. Does that contribute to some of this?
Yeah, though it seems to be, as far as we can tell, universal. So I mean, I think China is capitalist kind of in its own way, but obviously not in the same way. We translated our study into Mandarin and ran it on a sample of Chinese citizens responding in Mandarin. Oh, wow. And found the same thing, the same effect.
Interesting.
And it seems to be about the same size too. We also ran it, sort of a long story, but on Polish citizens who are answering in English. So Poland too, obviously not like the complete opposite of the US, but a different cultural context. We found the exact same thing.
Interesting.
And we didn't find any kind of individual differences that like, oh, it's just a certain kind of person who does this. Literally 90% of the people in our studies showed this effect, which is really weird as far as psychology studies go. Usually it's like, oh, it showed its effect. How, like what proportion? Like, oh, 57%. For this, it was 90%.
If I'm sitting here as I am, as the sole member of the Optimism Institute, and I'm looking for the positive in this, could one say, well, this means that people think about things getting better, and they could get better. How could this be different? Well, it could be better. On the one hand, you could say, well, they're complaining about the current state, but they're also, could you argue that is sort of a propensity to think that we're going to get better? It feels like it goes against the first study we talked about, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about it.
I sort of like this finding because it has this property of kind of being like a visual illusion. Like, have you ever seen that like duck or rabbit, depending on how you look at it?
Yes.
Because both of those things could be true. Like saying that things could be better, could be hopeful.
Right.
it also could be kind of cynical, right? Like things aren't good now because they could be better. We also did ask people, what's the likelihood that it will change in this way, which is by and large for the better.
Right.
And it was really a range. So there were some people who were talking about like, it could be better in this way and I expect it to be. But there were just as many people who are saying it could be better in this way and I don't expect it to be.
Yes.
So it was some mix of idle dreaming and sort of practical hoping. So I don't think either really dominated.
Adam says that when it comes to the negative impacts of media consumption, it's not so much the amount of bad news we consume, but more the ratio of good news to bad news that's most important. As we've discussed before on Blue Sky, we as consumers are not helpless here. And for our own benefit, we should work hard to manage this ratio. We should stay informed, yes, but that doesn't mean we have to drown in too much negativity, and we can make the choice to read and watch more about what's going right in the world. And I really want to underscore this idea about confirmation bias and how our underlying view of the world can be self-reinforcing. What I hear Adam saying is that if you approach life thinking that things are getting worse, you'll take note of evidence to confirm this belief. But we know empirically that this isn't the case. So wouldn't it be great for you and for all of us to adopt the mindset that the world is improving? With this as our starting point, our eyes will be cleared to take in so many facts, figures, anecdotes, and daily experiences to reinforce this more optimistic view, and we'd all be so much better off. This is what we're all about here at the Optimism Institute, and it's gratifying to hear a smart guy like Dr. Mastroianni giving us this science to back our beliefs. I could talk to Adam all day, but of course we had a show to wrap up here. And to kick off our final segment, I wanted Adam to talk about what his research might say about our attitudes towards technology. You mentioned, how could dogs be different? Do you think there's a similar or a different relationship to technology when you talk about that? Because I find it fascinating. You throw AI into a conversation and see what happens. And you've got the technophiles who say this is going to be the greatest thing ever. We're going to have assistants. We're going to do this. And then you have people who say it's literally going to destroy the human race. Is technology sort of this concept on steroids?
My bet would be, so we didn't have AI at the time. We did have like your phone, your television. I'm not sure if we had any other like purely technological thing. We did have like Google, Amazon, YouTube.
Okay.
And there too, people said, they could be better. And I'm sure actually if you ask people about AI, even the optimists would say, AI could be better in that it could take less time to train. It could be less energy intensive. Like it could be more accurate. And the AI doomers would be like, well, it could not take over the world. Like it could not be biased. But I think they're doing the same thing, right? But they from a different starting point.
So where do you go from here? What are you working on next? What is the next? Is it, and as you think about it, do you try to build on to this work that you've just done, or do you take a hard right or left turn and do something totally different? Like, how do you think about that, and what are you working on now?
Yeah. I really feel like writing this blog, Experimental History, it feels to me like a series of demonic possessions that like I become consumed by an idea. Yes. And the only way to exorcise it is to write it down and express it properly, at which point it then leaves the body. And what has been funny is like, it's been hard for me to plan out what the next one is going to be. So a lot of them have focused around basically how do we ensure a productive future of science, in particular psychology, my home field. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is in basically meta science, thinking about like, well, what does good science look like? How do you do it? And so I've written a lot about that. Long term, what I would love to do is just a sort of an idle hobby is figure out a paradigm for psychology. So that there's this theory in the nistory of science that that science progresses basically as a series of paradigms, which is like a set of norms, of way of looking at the world that then get overturned, and progress happens basically as you find a new one and fill in all the holes and then realize how it was wrong and flip it over and get another one. So like the periodic table is a great example of this in chemistry. So like when we realized that, if you order the elements in this order, like some are like things are missing there. And then we found out like, actually we discovered a thing and it fits in there. Like this seems to be a pretty useful way of organizing this knowledge.
Right.
We don't have that yet for psychology. What we kind of have is some little neighborhoods that we understand pretty well. We have like a bunch of individual findings, and what we don't really have is a way of fitting our knowledge together where we go, okay, if you organize it like this thing is missing, and we should go find that. It's kind of trippy to talk about because I think like before if you didn't have the concept of an element, for instance, it'd be really hard to talk about how to order them.
Right.
And like sense. one of like the early precursors to the periodic table, like included the elements of like electricity and magnetism, which didn't turn out to actually be elements. Right. So like the list looks really weird to us now. Yeah, but basically, I think like psychology is in its infancy. I think we're very early in its history, and a lot of interesting stuff is yet still to happen. And I want to be in the thick of that.
Well, it got my attention when I was speaking with Steven Pinker, and I think it's related. Where in this context, he was talking about his concerns about the lack of open discourse on college campuses, and what he said was, most of what we believe today is wrong. We don't know which is wrong or which is right. And if we can't debate and talk about it, we're never going to get to what's actually right. And it seems to me what you're describing in psychology fits that, right? That most of what we know now, when we thought electricity should be on the periodic table, we were wrong. And so it's sort of like, but we just don't know what we're wrong about unless we dig in like someone like you does and we speak openly about issues. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it seems so obvious when you say it, but I think implicitly a lot of people don't believe it. I think a lot of people believe we're pretty much at the end of science and we're kind of just crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And I wrote a post about this that called "Ideas Aren't Getting Harder to Find, and anyone who says otherwise is a coward, and I will fight you." Because people thought this, like at any point in history, you look back, you can find people in the 1890s saying there's nothing really left to do in physics except estimate the constants to the next decimal point.
Right.
And very shortly afterward, there'd be a huge revolution.
Right.
It's really hard to see these before they happen, especially if you don't believe that it's possible for them to happen.
I can't remember who said it, if they were famous or otherwise, who thought that they were going to shut down the patent office because everything had been invented. And this was like 75 years ago, same kind of thing. And by the way, I haven't put in a plug for experimental history, but your brain operates on a level that I only strive towards, but you have a sense of humor and a wit about you. And also I think what you've sort of described, this enthusiasm for how much is unknown out there, that I find really infectious. And it's, so I encourage people, it's on Substack. Experimental History is a great blog. Have you resisted the tug to host a podcast? Because everybody's doing it, Adam.
I know, it's the thing to do. Yeah, I'm too bad of a listener, I guess. I'd rather talk. I mean, I do a voiceover for every article. I read it out loud. So in my other life, I do improv and stand up comedy, and that is the sort of outlet for that. But yeah, I'd much rather appear on a podcast like this than host my own. I don't have to edit the audio. That's really a benefit.
Exactly. It's a lot of work. And are you teaching now as well?
I'm not right now. So I used to teach at Columbia in their business school. I used to teach negotiation. So that's another thing that I've done some writing on. Yeah, and a fun one. And I feel a little bit like my life was transformed by learning how to do it. And so one of the things that I've written on my blog over the past year was like a 3-part series trying to distill what I think is the most useful knowledge for negotiation, not for a business audience, for kind of at every audience, because everybody at some point will have to negotiate something.
Right.
And I think there's like a lot of free money just lying on the ground if you have even just an inkling of how to do it.
Well, and for a lot of people, I think negotiating is right up there with going to the dentist, and it's just something that people just don't like to do. So getting back to there's a bug. I'd love to wrap with this. Is your brain's tricked you into thinking everything is worse. Is it worth the effort to debug that? Is this just a fact of life and it is what it is? Or is it worth our collective effort to say, you know what, this is not healthy. This isn't helpful. And it's something we should work on?
It's a great question, because I think those two phenomena, the negativity bias, the fading affect bias, that create this illusion, I wouldn't want to reach into the brain and turn those off. I think those are there for a reason. The negativity bias makes a lot of sense evolutionarily, that makes a lot more sense to pay attention to the things that could kill you than the things that might feel nice.
Sure.
And we are the descendants of the people who did that.
Yes.
The fading affect bias makes a lot of sense even today, where this is part of what keeps you psychologically healthy, that when bad things happen to you, over time, they lose their sting, less so than the good things losing their pleasure. But this byproduct that they can create, that the sense that things are bad now, but they used to be good, that I would like to eliminate. And I think that the least that we could do is become bored when people say this.
Yes.
That like, we've heard this so much. And so like any politician who's like, I will restore the gold age, just be like, we gotta do something else. Like it's cliched now. So like, give us a better argument. If I give it any effect on the discourse, I think that would be a pretty good one to have.
Well, that is very welcome to hear. And I will say again, people should check out Experimental History. It's a really fun read. It'll make you think. It'll make you laugh. And you do have a great sense of humor, which doesn't always go hand in hand with the kind of scientific work you do. So it's a real treat. And I know you have a busy schedule, and I know you're very active with all your different pursuits. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today on the Blue Sky Podcast.
Of course, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's fun to hear Adam talk about what he wants to do next, and that perhaps he might even come up with a paradigm for psychology. I, for one, would certainly not bet against him. And regarding my story on the patent office, I did some more research and found that I had part of it right, but the story actually goes back way more than 75 years. It was in 1899 when Charles H. Duell, who was in fact the commissioner of the patent office, was alleged to have said, quote, "Everything that can be invented has been invented," unquote, and that we might as well shut down the entity he was overseeing. But wait, there's more. This story has long since been debunked, and it's time to clear Mr. Duell's name once and for all. Not only did he not say this, he actually took a far more, dare I say, optimistic view when he said in 1902, quote, "In my opinion, all previous advances in the various lines of invention will appear totally insignificant when compared with those which the present century will witness. I almost wish that I might live my life over again to see the wonders which are at the threshold," unquote. Popular history, it seems, owes this man a big apology. And back to Adam, I'd like to amplify what he said about how we should all become bored when people say that things were better in the past. It's an old trope. It's not true, and it's just not healthy. I hope you enjoyed and were inspired by this Blue Sky conversation with Dr. Adam Mastroianni. And based on his research, if you want to work on managing your media diet, consider following the Optimism Institute on social media. And of course, subscribe to the Blue Sky Podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And while you're at it, be sure to check out Adam's Experimental History on Substack. It's really great. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.